So we're going to get started. Other folks will fall in. Good afternoon. Welcome to panel 5, Youth and HIV. I am very excited to serve as the moderator today. I am Dr. Sabrina Smiley, Assistant Professor of Public Health at San Diego State University School of Public Health. And we have 3 really exciting presentations today. I'm going to let the presenters introduce themselves before they give their presentation, but I do have a few housekeeping items. The first one will be if everyone can stay muted throughout the presentations. Please drop your questions or comments into the chat, and we will have Q&A after the presenters finish. So Q&A will be at the end. Let's see. Yeah, I think I covered everything, all of the items. So let's start with our first presenter. Should be Miss Roxana.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roxana. I'm a staff research associate in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA, and I'm also a PhD student in the Department of Epidemiology. And I love your background, Dr. Smiley. My MPH was from SDSU, so I love that.
Excellent.
Should I move forward with the presentation, or are all presenters introducing themselves?
Yeah, each presenter will introduce themselves. So please share your screen.
Okay.
And, yeah.
So can everyone see this? My presentation is going to be on alcohol misuse during the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders among youth at risk or living with HIV. It was a study in LA and New Orleans. So there is evidence from prior epidemics that quarantine and stay-at-home orders issued by governments to mitigate the spread of a virus can have negative mental health consequences due to the stress and social isolation. So stressful life events can induce negative emotions and psychological distress, which in turn can trigger anxiety, depression, and alcohol or substance use. Marginalized subgroups like sexual and gender minorities, youth living with HIV, and youth experiencing housing insecurity are particularly susceptible to alcohol use and misuse. And there have been studies of adult samples that have seen an increase in alcohol use during the COVID-19 stay-at-home period. But recent studies of college students have shown that alcohol use either stayed the same or slightly decreased. So the goal of this study was to examine important factors linked to alcohol misuse during the stay-at-home orders in a sample of marginalized youth at risk or living with HIV in LA or New Orleans. So data for the study came from an adolescent medical trials network study called CARES. CARES consists of 3 interrelated studies testing behavioral interventions to improve HIV prevention and care engagement among adolescents between the ages of 12 to 24. Participants were recruited from homeless shelters, LGBT organizations, community health centers, and online dating apps. To be eligible for the study, youth had to be between the ages of 12 to 24. They would answer a short screening questionnaire asking about things like condomless sex, history of STI, substance use, and history of incarceration. And then depending on their HIV status, after consent and enrollment, participants would be placed in one of 3 studies. Although the designs differed, the interventions had common components with increasing intensity. So everyone started with automated messaging and monitoring where participants received daily text messages tailored to their specific health needs. The next level was online peer support. And then lastly, it was telehealth coaching by trained paraprofessionals. The original data set included a little over 1,700 participants that were recruited from May 2017 to August 2019. In October 2020, participants who had a valid contact information were invited to complete an online survey to assess the impact of COVID-19 stay-at-home orders on multiple aspects of their daily life, including risk behaviors and any life stressors. So using that data, we examined risk factors associated with hazardous alcohol use and binge drinking among 478 youth who responded to the survey. Variables included demographic information like age, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. We also looked at changes during the stay-at-home period, like any changes they had in their living situation, either due to financial issues or school closures or like school going remote. changes in their level of anxiety, depression, and any changes in work hours. So if they had like a decrease in number of paid work hours. Since participants were part of a larger care study, we also had information of their baseline drinking habits, which proved to be very useful. Hazardous alcohol use and binge drinking were assessed using the Audit C questionnaire. So the cutoffs for hazardous alcohol use are a score greater than 3 for females and a score greater than 4 for males. And then binge drinking is the third item within the Audit C, and it's defined as drinking more than 6 drinks in one occasion. So we use chi-square test to examine differences between hazardous alcohol users and non-hazardous alcohol users, and repeated the analyses to compare binge drinkers versus non-binge drinkers. We entered demographic characteristics and factors that differed significantly between hazardous alcohol use or binge drinking into 3 separate logistic regression models for each outcome, with progressive adjustments of covariates. So our first model, Model A, included demographic variables and adjusted for HIV status and the coaching intervention. Model B further accounted for variables measured during the stay-at-home orders, and then Model C further adjusted for baseline hazardous alcohol use or binge drinking. Since there were meaningful differences between participants with complete and incomplete data, we utilized multiple imputation to handle the missing data. So the average participant age was 23, more than 80% were assigned male at birth, and 16% identified as transgender, gender diverse. Around 53% of participants reported their sexual orientation as gay or lesbian, and 21% as bisexual. 37% were Latinx, and 36% Black or African American. Roughly 52% were employed during the stay-at-home orders, and 17% were students. Approximately 60% reported a decrease in paid work hours, and almost 46% moved to another place to live during that stay-at-home period. Roughly 77% reported increases in anxiety or worry or depression and sadness, and a similar proportion reported decreases in quality of life and sleep. And then approximately within this group, 14% were living with HIV. So 33% of the sample were hazardous alcohol users, and 43% were binge drinkers. Looking at the differences between hazardous drinkers versus not, we found that hazardous drinkers were more likely to be white compared to other races. They were also more likely to report decreases in paid work hours and more likely to be illicit drug users. Rates of binge drinking were higher among older participants relative to younger ones. I think the cutoff was around 23. And then white participants were also more likely to be binge drinkers compared to other races. Binge drinkers were also more likely to report decreases in quality of life and sleep, and increases in their levels of anxiety, worry, depression, or sadness. Binge drinkers were also more likely to use illicit drugs compared to non-binge drinkers. And when we looked at baseline differences, the median Audit C score measured during that stay-at-home period was lower than what the median score was at baseline. So this table shows results from our logistic regressions looking at factors associated with hazardous alcohol use using multiple imputation. I've cut it down a bit for the sake of brevity, but the odds of hazardous alcohol use are lower for all races compared to white participants. After including characteristics measured during the stay-at-home period, the association does remain significant. Adjustment for baseline hazardous alcohol use increases the odds of hazardous alcohol use during that stay-at-home period for all of the races, but the only association that remains significant is for Asian, Hawaiian Pacific Islander, Alaskan Native, and other youth. The borderline association between hazardous alcohol use and HIV status in Model A becomes more evident when the characteristics measured during the stay-at-home period are included. And then illicit drug use is really strongly associated with higher odds of hazardous alcohol use. Although the estimated odds ratio is attenuated, it does remain significant after adjusting for baseline hazardous alcohol use. So somewhat similar to what we saw when looking at hazardous alcohol use, the odds of binge drinking are lower among Black African American participants and Asian, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Alaskan Natives compared to white participants. Although inclusion of characteristics measured during the stay-at-home period slightly increases the odds ratio, adjustment for baseline binge drinking changes our p-values for some of those groups. And there are higher odds of binge drinking is also associated with illicit drug use during stay-at-home orders, and that association does remain significant after further adjustment for baseline binge drinking. So although it's limited in its sample size, the study was able to examine alcohol misuse among highly marginalized youth whose life circumstances have placed them at an increased risk for negative outcomes and makes them particularly susceptible to alcohol use and misuse. Our study is also significant in that it reports the more serious alcohol misuse behaviors like hazardous alcohol use and binge drinking rather than just like general levels of alcohol consumption. As we saw in the previous slides, participants who reported hazardous alcohol use or binge drinking during the stay-at-home orders had higher rates of alcohol misuse and drug use at baseline compared to those who didn't. So this really demonstrates that past behavior is one of the best predictors of future behavior and kind of points to the importance of prevention and early intervention. Our study does mirror non-COVID related studies of alcohol and drug use behaviors among young adolescents. So we do see that participants who report hazardous alcohol use or binge drinking were more likely to be wide and illicit drug users compared to those who don't. So even outside of COVID studies, that seems to be what the theme was. As with all studies, ours is not without limitations. Our findings should be interpreted with caution because they're based on a subset of ATN CARES participants who completed the COVID-19 survey. And so our results could be impacted by self-selection. There were differences between participants who responded to the COVID survey and those who didn't on some baseline characteristics like income and level of education. Standardized and validated measures of COVID-19 related changes like the quality of life indicators weren't available. So that could be measurement error could have impacted our findings. And lastly, our sample is comprised of marginalized youth who met a very strict eligibility criteria. So our results don't generalize to the broader population. I think future studies would greatly benefit from looking at longitudinal data to find predictive variables associated with hazardous alcohol use and binge drinking and leverage results from these studies into treatment and prevention intervention targeting high-risk populations. And as always, a larger sample size. That's always a great future direction to go into. But thank you to everyone involved in these projects. It literally is a community of people who make a project of this caliber and scale happen. So thank you to everyone and our participants. I also have our center and our ATN website on the slide. But yeah, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Roxana.
Of course.
So next we will have Dr. Joshua Russo.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen. Sorry, I think I just stole it from the last person. Okay, hopefully I'm sharing what looks like it could be a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Russo. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, but I'm presenting on work that was started while I was still a PhD candidate at USC Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work. And I want to acknowledge the support from the CHIPTS P30 that actually funded this work. So many thanks around. The title, which gives away the whole story, is Violence Experiences Are Associated with HIV Transmission Risk Over 1 Year among a prospective sample of sexual minority adolescents in the United States. Let me try to break that down. You know, as a point of background, you know, I think we all know that sexual minority adolescents bear disproportionate HIV risk. Some of that is attributed to higher rates of penetrative sex without condoms. So penetrative vaginal, anal, frontal sex, things like that. And also increased rates of sex while feeling the effects of drugs or alcohol. Let me start my timer too. And then of course we know that you know, elevated rates in young sexual minority men as well. Other background information on things that are correlated with HIV risk or associated with HIV risk behaviors. We know that mental health symptomology like depression, anxiety, even post-traumatic stress all have relations to HIV risk behaviors. A lot of work on sexual minority stress and discrimination. So stigma associated with sexual minority identity plays a big role. And there's been lots of studies that show that. And also some emerging evidence on interpersonal violence. So things like dating violence, domestic violence, IPV, sexual assault. Work primarily done with adult populations, especially female sex participants. but some emerging work in younger populations and sexual minority populations. So the primary research for this particular study is sort of how do mental health symptomology, minority stress, and IPV contribute to HIV transmission risk in a sample of sexual minority adolescents over the course of 1 year. This is preliminary analyses for a larger study that I'm doing. So for this particular sample and analysis, we recruited 1,076 sexual minority adolescents. We actually did the recruitment from May to March, or May 2018 to March 2019. This was for a longitudinal study. At the time, they were 14 to 17 years old. They had to have an identity that was not 100% heterosexual. We borrowed that language from AdHealth, and they had to live in the United States. And so this was an online survey. We surveyed them every 6 months for up to 3 years, and we're just now finishing the last like 36-month wave of surveys with them. All the numbers that I'm going to show were crunched in Stata version 17. As far as the measures that we used or that I'm using in this analysis, I'm including age, which again ranged from 14 to 17 at baseline, their sex at birth, which based on the fact that intersex wasn't an option for people born 14 to 17 years ago before that, is male and female. Race, ethnicity, which are included here, all borrowed from the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Sexual identity is collapsed down into categories of bisexual or pansexual, gay or lesbian, another identity, and also queer. And then for mental health symptomology, we're looking at depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress measured by the CESD4, the GAD-7, and the PCL, the post-traumatic checklist civilian edition. Now I mentioned we were also measuring minority stress. So this is using a validated scale from the lab I was in at USC, developed for adolescents. And so it measures 10 domains of minority stress. So I've included some examples here. For example, a subscale of social marginalization has items that have prompts like I have felt unsafe or threatened in the neighborhood where I live because I'm LGBTQ, negative expectancies, things like I think I will lose friends if I come out as LGBTQ, identity management, things like I feel pressured to label my sexual orientation, right? There's some examples here. For time, I'll move forward a little bit. For IPV, we use measures from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey because it's been used with this age group for many years now. And so we looked at 4 different measures of IPV. Physical dating violence and sexual dating violence. So these questions were asked at baseline. During the past 12 months, how many times did someone you were dating or going out with either physically hurt you on purpose or force you to do sexual things that you did not want to do? We also assessed sexual assault more generally, which is similar, but it says during the past 12 months, how many times did anyone force you to do sexual things that you did not want to do? And then there's also a lifetime measure of forced sexual intercourse or rape, which is have you ever been physically forced to have sexual intercourse when you did not want to? So we collected all of those at baseline. And then for measures of HIV transmission risk, we combined the next 2 waves of data collection, the 6-month and the 12-month. And if anybody endorsed either of these things at the 6 or 12-month, then they were marked as having one of these 3 measures of HIV transmission risk. So they were asked, since the last time you took the survey on the date, which we piped in, have you had sex with someone without discussing their HIV status, with someone without using a condom, or while feeling the effects of drugs or alcohol? And I'll mention that the numbers that I'm going to show are do not include oral sex. They only include penetrative sex. So as far as the overall sample, you can see that primarily that the largest group was 16-year-olds, but there's a pretty good spread. There's fewer 14-year-olds probably than we would have wanted. Really predominantly a female sample, sex at birth, mostly bi and pan sexual identified, predominantly white non-Hispanic. This was a US-wide study that we conducted online. And then importantly, as far as the measures of IPV, so 6% reported physical dating violence in the past year, 11% endorsed sexual dating violence, 19% endorsed general sexual assault, and 13% reported a history of forced intercourse. And then also 15% of them said that they, over the last 6 months, or since their last survey, they had sex with someone before talking about their HIV status. 24% said they had condomless sex, and 11% said they had sex while feeling the effects of drugs or alcohol. Of the 54 possible minority stressors that they could endorse, the max was 50. That any one person put, many people also put 0. The mean was about 21. For anxiety, which ranges from 0 to 21, the mean was 12. And for depression, goes from 0 to 12. The mean was about 6. And then for post-traumatic stress, which ranges from 6 to 30, the mean was about 18, the score on that. So for each of the 3 HIV sex risk outcomes, we did multivariate logistic regressions. These are the odds ratios that came out of those regressions. So the solid bars are the things that were statistically significant, and then the sort of non-solid bars were not significant. So for sex before discussing HIV status, age was significantly associated, so that each year increase was associated with a 37% higher odds of reporting sex before discussing HIV status. The multiracial group had an 88% higher odds of reporting sex before discussing HIV status. Interestingly, people who reported more anxiety symptoms reported lower odds. And then particularly of interest for our study, for each additional IPV experience that someone endorsed, they had a 51% higher odds of reporting sex before discussing HIV status. And so for the IPV, again, that could range from 0 to 4 experiences that they could have said. For penetrative sex without a condom, age again was associated, as was IPV, where for each additional violence experience, they were at 48% higher odds. And again, anxiety was lowered their odds slightly. And then for sex while feeling the effects of drugs or alcohol, age, again, associated, older folks were more likely to report sex while feeling the effects of drugs or alcohol. Again, these are all youth 14 to 17. And by the time they took the 6-month and the 12-month survey, they could have been as old as 18. So they were all not of legal age for consuming alcohol. In this particular analysis, the bisexual and pansexual youth had 80% higher odds of reporting sex while sort of under the influence. And again, IPV was associated such that for each additional violence experience, they were 62% higher odds of reporting sex while feeling the effects of drugs or alcohol. So sort of putting that together, we see that across the board of at least these 3 things that we looked at, experiences of IPV did precede reports of the sexual risk behaviors over the next year. And again, those percentages, increased percentages, were about 48 to 62% higher odds. And so the relationship between HIV transmission risk and minority stress or mental health no longer was, it didn't sort of pan out once we looked at the violence variables. And so like previous studies that I've worked on, minority stress was associated with all of these things, and mental health was also associated with these outcomes. And they're also predictive of violence experiences, but when we look at them all together, the violence sort of blows up the models. So we're moving forward. We have some next steps that we're doing with the study. We're looking at sort of latent factors of violence in mental health and minority stress to see if there's some sort of underlying latent factors that might help predict some of these outcomes. Given that it's a longitudinal study, we want to look at mediation. So since I've seen in other studies that I've done that minority stress might predict violence, is violence sort of a mediator? We've added additional measures of IPV in later waves. So we're also looking at perpetration. The stuff that I presented so far was just about victimization. And we're also including substance use in some of our larger analyses because we have questions on that as well. So just from the results of this study, I have the questions of like, are the more anxious sexual minority adolescents, are they reporting less sex overall? Are they having less risky sex because they're having less sex? We can look at that, but I didn't yet. Are any of the subscales of minority stress, are they better at predicting versus the overall scale, since that didn't pan out? And then also, where are some sexual minority adolescents even learning about relationships and sex? We have some qualitative interviews happening right now where we're actually interviewing the participants in this longitudinal study, asking them questions about sort of where they're learning about relationships and sex. Those are the references I cited earlier. I'm happy to share this with anyone, and it's probably already on the website. And I know we'll hold questions till later, but I just want to say thanks to the participants and the folks that have supported me in this research across a lot of institutions that I won't list for time, but thanks everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joshua. Just a friendly reminder, everyone, if you do have questions to, yes, really great, to drop them in the chat. We will have Q&A after Dr. Storholm and Vincent's talk. So yes, final talk will be Dr. Eric Storholm and Dr. Wilson Vincent.
All right, hi everybody. Thanks so much, Joshua. I'd love to follow up with you on your presentation and talk more about the IPV aspects. That's actually, I have a new project that we're just starting up that's looking at that. And so it'd be great to connect with you. So, so unfortunately, Will can't be here. Will is my longtime partner. We were both postdocs at UCSF under Susan Keglis. She was our postdoc mentor. And so this is really a collaboration. So this is also, the project I'm about to present is also a CHIPS funded pilot project. And it allowed us to do some additional analyses on an ongoing cohort we have of young Black sexual minority men living with HIV from 2 cities in Texas, Houston and Dallas. And so this talk is entitled Investigating the Impact of Resilience, Social Support, and Healthcare Empowerment on HIV care engagement among young Black sexual minority men living with HIV in the US South, overcoming social and structural barriers. All right, so to give a little background, I'm sure most of you know this, but currently young Black sexual minority men are the most disproportionately impacted by HIV in the US, and particularly in the US South. HIV transmissibility is heightened by less engagement in the HIV care continuum and lower viral suppression among young Black sexual minority men living with HIV. So this project was really informed by minority stress theory and syndemic theory. And what we wanted to do was conduct exploratory analyses to look at the data from this community cohort of 224 guys that remain in the study. Like I said, recruited from Dallas and Houston, and we wanted to better understand the correlates of HIV care continuum engagement. So there were 2 specific aims of the pilot study. One was to examine the associations of multiple latent predictor variables that we know to be related to HIV outcomes, such as socioeconomic distress, intimate partner violence, depression, and then also some protective factors like resilience and HIV-related social support. And we wanted to see how these factors were associated with HIV care engagement among these guys. And then our second aim was to test whether healthcare empowerment mediates the impact of these latent predictor variables on HIV care engagement. And so here, healthcare empowerment, we use Mallory Johnson's healthcare empowerment inventory, which measures 4 constructs of healthcare empowerment: how engaged, how informed, how collaborative, and how committed one is to engaging in their healthcare. So you can infer how important that would be for folks managing a chronic condition like HIV. So the specific measures that we used for socioeconomic distress, we used 3 items: running out of money for basic necessities, borrowing money from a friend or relative to get by financially, and exchanging sex with someone in exchange for money, drugs, or housing. Intimate partner violence, we used Rob Stevenson's Gay Bisexual Men IPV scale. For depressive symptoms, we used the CHES. For resilience, we used the Wagnall and Young resilience measure, 14 items, measuring more stable sort of state-based resilience. We also measured HIV-related social support with some items that were adapted from the perceived social support from friends and family scale. Healthcare empowerment, I also already mentioned how we measured that with the Mallory Johnson's inventory. And then for our outcome, engagement in HIV care, we went according to the United States guidelines for HIV care engagement. And we measured being on antiretroviral treatment, being retained in HIV care, and also being virally suppressed. Okay, I apologize, this is kind of small. I copied it from the manuscript, but basically just to give you an overview of the sample. So again, these were all young Black sexual minority men living with HIV, and the average age was around 24, between 24 and 25, with a range from 18 to 29. So these were young adults. And as far as education, the majority of them had a high school diploma or some college. Most of them made under $40,000 a year. And about half were employed full-time, but importantly, about 30% were unemployed. And then with respect to HIV care continuum outcomes, 83% reported that they were on antiretroviral therapy. 85% reported that they had been retained in care, and we measured that as having had at least one lab draw for HIV care in the last 12 months. And then 78% reported that they had an undetectable viral load at the last time that they were tested. So for our methods, we first conducted bivariate analyses, which established associations of each of the latent predictor variables of interest and the latent outcome variable, HIV care continuum engagement. And then we used MPLUS to construct a structural equation model predicting HIV care continuum engagement and assessed for the potential mediating effects of healthcare empowerment. So here's our conceptual mediation model, where you can see the predictor variables associated with the healthcare outcome engagement and care. And then we wanted to test to see whether or not healthcare empowerment was really the mechanism by which those relationships were occurring. So here, this is the model looking at just the correlates of engagement in HIV care. And so you can see that the participants who reported higher levels of socioeconomic distress, intimate partner violence, and depressive symptoms reported less engagement in HIV care. Those who endorsed higher levels of resilience and healthcare empowerment reported greater engagement in HIV care. Those who reported higher levels of resilience endorsed higher levels of healthcare empowerment than those who reported lower levels of resilience. And those who reported higher levels of HIV-related social support indicated higher levels of healthcare empowerment than those who endorsed lower levels of HIV-related social support. So all of the relationships were in the direction that you would assume. And you can see that when we entered them all into the model together, it was the depressive symptoms that really had the strongest impact and were significantly associated with engagement in care, as well as healthcare empowerment. So then when we tested the mediation model, we could see that healthcare empowerment mediated the association between resilience and engagement in HIV care, and the association between HIV-related social support and engagement in HIV care. So those who reported higher levels of resilience endorsed higher levels of engagement in HIV care, and this association was accounted for by higher reported levels of healthcare empowerment. So those who reported higher levels of HIV-related social support endorsed higher levels of engagement in HIV care, and this association was also accounted for by greater reported levels of healthcare empowerment. So in the mediation model, both resilience and HIV-related social support were associated with the mediator, healthcare empowerment, but socioeconomic distress, intimate partner violence, and depressive symptoms were not associated with healthcare empowerment. Socioeconomic distress, intimate partner violence, and depressive symptoms were not significantly associated with the mediator, healthcare empowerment. Okay, so what does this mean? So the findings suggest that while all of the predictor variables were independently associated with HIV care engagement, healthcare empowerment and depression may be the most predictive of those variables. Future intervention efforts should target improving healthcare empowerment, both directly and indirectly, by aiming to also bolster resilience and social support. Mental health needs need to be an additional target given the robust negative association of depression with HIV care engagement. Although healthcare empowerment was a robust correlate and mechanism of engaging in HIV care, we should be cautious about placing a disproportionate onus on young Black sexual minority men to navigate challenging healthcare systems that might be dismissive or negligent, not affirming at best and hostile at worst. Interventions need to focus on improving access to affirming healthcare, connecting young Black sexual minority men to it, and empowering continued engagement. So future directions, I would like to develop and test home-based HIV care men's network and virtual workshop run by young Black sexual minority men living with HIV that engages young Black sexual minority men living with HIV to critically engage with topics including resilience, masculinity, sexuality, mental health, and social relationships, and empower them in their healthcare engagement. So the workshop would utilize an empowerment perspective that develops and promotes young Black sexual minority men's skills for critically engaging with norms and sources of oppression in the broader social and structural environments. The peer-led interventions could focus on increasing social agency and self-advocacy and promoting linkage and access to social services to help address upstream structural determinants of health. Peers could help navigate and encourage participants to connect and engage in home-based HIV care, including ongoing HIV viral load testing and medication adherence, or long-acting injectable treatments from home with virtual connection to community providers. Of course, there were limitations. Our latent variables inherently cannot be observed and instead consist of proxy indicators of the underlying latent constructs. Other observed or unobserved indicators may be more robust indicators of underlying constructs. Participants were recruited from 2 cities in Texas and from a variety of pre-specified venues. So that limits generalizability. And finally, the data were self-reported and subject to social desirability bias. And that's it. Thank you.
Wow. Excellent work.